schools are not buildings. Yes, they're institutions, but they're communities of human persons. And that community, not some abstract multi-billion-dollar operation like the College Board, is in control of what we teach. And why would we go through all of the pain and anguish and sacrificing of material resources to just give that control to the College Board? Welcome back to the Kevin Roberts Show. Here we are in 2023. So much is going on in the country, and so much of that is tactical. It's short term, very important fights, legislative fights, political fights. I'm told there's even a presidential race going on that isn't necessarily the smoothest for either side. But, you know, as much as Heritage cares about all of those things are important. Something we care about just as much is building institutions, particularly institutions of education. And you know that as much as I can, I try to work in guests on this show who certainly are adjacent to the policy and political world, but are doing work that, frankly, is more important than what's going on in politics. And this guest this week is someone who I think personifies that. You have to account for my bias. He's one of my closer friends in life, someone I met several years ago. I'll let him tell that story. But Jeremy Tate, the founder and CEO of the Classical Learning Test, is someone who is upending. He is disrupting American education. And you know, for me, I think American education is past due to be upended. So Jeremy Tate, my great friend, thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you, brother. And Dr. Kevin Roberts, I just want to start off with a big congrats to you. I've heard people calling Heritage, since you arrived, beast mode Heritage. I mean, it is. I came the first time and people are like, we're playing offense now, and you are. And so congrats. I was so excited that you got tapped for this very important position, and you're doing an incredible job.
Well, that's kind of you. You know, it is a consummate team effort here. And so all I do is once in a while sprinkle in some clarity about what's at stake. And truly, and I can count on my colleagues in every corner of this great institution to say, yeah, let's go do that.
Well, and Kevin, you really are one of my heroes. And one of the things you have taught me is a sense of urgency and how crucial a sense of urgency is to what we're doing. I mean, America, we're watching in many ways a collapse, and Heritage is leading with a sense of urgency to recover and to remember what's at stake here.
That's really well said, and much more succinct than I might put it. So I'm sure our audience is saying, man, you ought to have Jeremy co-host the show. Maybe we'll do that one day.
Let's do it. I'm in.
Yeah, but it's true that I think often I'm asked, as I know you are, especially about what's going on in the conservative movement. You know, my domain, it's adjacent to yours. And people ask, what are the big reasons for the fissures in the conservative movement? And some of that would be differences of opinion on foreign policy questions, on the role of the state in various parts of our lives. But ultimately, it's about a sense of urgency. And I don't mean this in any way, in a derogatory way to those with whom I disagree, but you know, just a respectful disagreement that a lot of people who are legitimately conservative, but don't necessarily understand why it's important to be on offense. It isn't that they misunderstand what's at stake. I mean, they love America as much as you and I do. It's that they don't yet apprehend the urgency of the moment.
Yeah.
And it's that urgency of the moment that I know prompted you several years ago to be doing what you're doing, the Classical Learning Test, which we're going to cover very thoroughly in this conversation. But if you don't mind, before we get into that, you got to tell us your story. I mean, you're a teacher.
Sure. Yeah. I love telling this story. So, 10 years ago, I make a transition from the public school arena to a faithfully Catholic school, Mountain to Sales Academy, where my daughters go now, run by the Dancing Dominicans, as we call them. One of the orders that's really growing and vibrant, very Christ-focused, beautiful order there in Catonsville, Maryland. And one of the really shocking things when I got there, and I could say so many great things about the school, but I was really shocked, Kevin, with the power and influence of the College Board at this school. And in fact, one of the ways that we would compete for students in marketing with all the other Catholic schools and other privates in Baltimore was marketing all things College Board connected. And so what I mean is we're selling and marketing on our average AP scores, or the number of national merit, or how many APs we offered there. And it really hit home for me when the sweet Dominican sisters introduced an intro to philosophy and an intro to Christian apologetics, and hardly any students signed up. And as a college counselor at the time, I was talking to students, why didn't you sign up for the philosophy class? These are the greatest questions anyone can ask. And the number one answer was, well, Mr. Tate, there are not any AP points. It would hurt my GPA. if I took this class, even if I got an A. And so it was this moment where I thought, this is madness. Here we have this left-wing organization, the College Board, and make no mistake, it is a left-wing organization, calling the shots for our Catholic school in Catonsville, Maryland, that kids are not taking philosophy or Christian apologetics because the College Board doesn't prioritize. And so it was a wild idea of, there needs to be an alternative. And in fact, I pretty quickly just started calling anyone who I thought might possibly be sympathetic. And not very many people called me back. And I called the president of Wyoming Catholic College. This is 2015, before we had a website, before we were incorporated as a company or anything. And I left a voicemail, and I was completely shocked when 45 minutes later, I get a call back. And you completely validated the idea. You said you've been thinking about this for a long time. And I don't know what would have happened had you not made that call back. I really don't, I think at that moment, and this has been so much of the CLT story has been very providential, kind of God providing what's needed at any given moment. But the call here, we had a college president who saw it and saw the need for it.
Well, a lot to say there, but I would say my revelation about the College Board happened about the second year of in the history of the school that I started, John Paul the Great Academy, still just in operation but flourishing in spite of its founder. But in the second year, we were building out the high school curriculum, and I had taught AP courses and was fond of them in my field, American history, although it was beginning to get, at that point, to get today what we would call woke. And I realized as I am building this curriculum, we're accepting no money from the state we were in, that reviewing the College Board requirements for these AP courses, we just weren't going to do it for the precise reason you mentioned about the school where you were, where your kids, your girls are, but also that we are a community in this school. And schools are not buildings. Yes, they're institutions, but they're communities of human persons. And that community, not some abstract multi-billion-dollar operation like the College Board, is in control of what we teach. And why would we go through all of the pain and anguish and sacrificing of material resources to just give that control to the College Board? I had to sell the parents of the really top-notch students about why we weren't doing this. And we had some other ways that we could help them get some college credit. But to this day, that's true. And I will say, to kind of return the compliment to you genuinely, that the emergence of the classical learning test has really put wind in the sails of these parents, of these teachers, school administrators, to say, what we have been feeling, as I was in the years before you called me and left that voicemail, is legitimate. Most importantly, there's an answer, there's a solution to this problem. So tell us about the CLT.
Yeah, I love that. Growing up, I grew up in Oregon. I remember in elementary school, the teachers telling us that the metric system would be taking the place of the standard system.
I remember hearing that too.
Right, yeah. So centimeters, and we learned all of this. And then we just kind of waited for a while. And it never happened. And that concept of like actually changing the measuring stick itself is a really hard thing to do. And so, even today, a great event at the Heritage Foundation, my dear friend David Goodwin, so much of what they've seen in the success of classical schools is using the SAT, using the PSAT as a metric. But what we've seen in the past 10 years is the College Board itself become deeply compromised. It wasn't too long ago, maybe 5 years ago, the National Association of Scholars released a 40-page report on the ties between the Communist Party in China and the College Board, and essentially whitewashing the revolution in China, painting a very rosy picture of the situation there, and further diminishing the role of Christendom, of the Catholic Church, and Western civilization. And so this is slowly starting to come out and be exposed, but it's not enough to just say College Board is toxic. We need an alternative, and that's the gap that we've been trying to fill.
So, just from like a business standpoint, classical learning test is a threat to the market share that College Board has, and that alone is a real bonus for education reformers. But beyond that, I think you would argue more substantively than that, is the content, the substance of the classical learning test. And that has many facets to it, but I'll let you summarize it before we jump headlong into that sea.
Sure. Yeah. So there's a couple things here. And so what we're talking about is essentially source material. What is actually on the test? And, Kevin, when I was running an SAT, ACT prep company, I was surprised with two things. One is what was on the SAT and PSAT, and the other was what was left off of it. So what was on is often you would find just really boring text, and that kind of confused me. Why would they choose this meaningless passage about the development of processing of yogurt or penguins in Antarctica, right? Here's an opportunity to put millions of students in front of a text, and this is the one. And I found out over the years, well, the reason is because they have a very powerful sensitivity committee. And I've met people on the sensitivity committee of the College Board, and I actually think
sounds god awful by the way.
Well, and I think it actually has decent origin. So the idea in the 90s, as I understand it, was that okay, if a student maybe they had their uncle commit suicide or something, you wouldn't want a passage that references suicide. It's going to trigger the student, and that's all fine. But it's gotten totally insane. And so I met with a guy in Annapolis. He said, "Look, everything is objected to by someone on this committee as offensive." Right? And so we just said, we're just going to take the exact opposite approach at CLT and take the position that if it's not offensive to anyone, it's probably not important either. Right? And so we're putting students, I'm a Christian. We put students in front of Nietzsche, in front of Darwin, in front of Karl Marx. Karl Marx is on our author bank. Like read directly from the horse's mouth So I was shocked with what they were putting on and this bland, meaningless, and that's because of the sensitivity committees and coddling these students. The other one is what they're leaving off, though, and maybe that's more important, is that the SAT, the College Board is 125 years old, and they've had tremendous opportunity to make it clear what is and what isn't important in American education. And you can just imagine as a kind of a hypothetical, if everyone generally knew that, okay, on the SAT, you're likely to see John Locke, you're likely to see Aristotle, something from Plato's Republic. That would have a profound impact on what happens in the classroom. But instead, they completely minimize the role of the Western intellectual tradition, certainly the Christian and Catholic intellectual tradition as well. Students now graduate high school, they've never heard the word philosophy or theology. These were the queen of the sciences for the beginnings of the university system. And so our thought is that if you can change the test, the most important test, there's going to be huge downstream consequences, positive consequences of doing so.
So CLT, Classical Learning Test, has been in operation for several years now. Tell us about, before we get into some of the specifics about grade levels and what you test for, tell us about the growth.
Sure. Yeah. First test we ever had, it was 2016. We had 46 students nationwide. CLT was not like meeting with investors and having this big business plan. It was bootstrapping and figuring it out from day one. The last test, since Florida just 3 weeks ago, Kevin, we're up over 300%. And more than 50% of those students are from Florida. I've been down there at least every month. People have been waiting for an alternative. I can't tell you how many people have come up and they say, thank you that there's finally an alternative to the College Board. And so right now, this past year, we did a little over 50,000. I think for the new academic year, 23-24, we're anticipating maybe close to 100,000 students.
Florida's been in the news as it relates to the classical learning test. Not everyone in the audience may be up to speed on that, but it's a really important development, not just for CLT, but for education reform generally. It's important that instruments of disruption, which the classical learning test is, other entities like private schools might be, that they get not just news, but that they get adopted. And Florida provided some wind in your sails. So tell us about it.
It's been wild. We were in some ways watching the news like everyone else when Governor DeSantis got in a fight with the College Board, which we loved, and we thought, we could be impacted by this. And he was on TV saying, there's got to be other companies that provide these services, and we're going to look. And we thought, we actually don't know of too many. And so very quickly, and they don't mess around in Florida. Within a few weeks, we were in conversation, went down and met with Chancellor Rodriguez, and we got into the legislation just a few weeks after that. And it was really incredible the way they advocated for this in the session. It was almost no objections to CLT. And so it fully tied it to Bright Futures, Bright Futures is designed to stop the brain drain, keep smart students in the state of Florida. And it does that in a powerful way. If you talk to somebody in admissions from another state, they don't love Bright Futures because they know how powerful it is in keeping smart Florida kids in Florida. But what that has done is it's driven up the University of Florida to number 5, if we trust U.S. News and World Report. Florida State to number 20. It is an educational model, I believe, and I'm sure we would agree. I mean, I know Heritage gave Florida number 1 in their first Education Freedom Report card. And meeting these people, it's been incredible. There is an absolute sense of urgency, as we talked about, to restore a high bar of educational excellence in that state.
Yeah, the thing that's impressed me there, and thankfully we're beginning to see it, that sense of urgency among other state leaders is all of the leadership in Florida, starting with the governor, said, politics be damned. We are putting kids first and foremost, and this is the right policy. We're going to implement it. And I don't think it's possible to overstate the political influence that the College Board has in the circles where people care deeply about education, which would be a big proportion of every legislature, the majority in some states. And so taking them on was really important for the sake of kids' futures.
Yeah, and again, I think David Coleman is an interesting character. He's the CEO of the College Board, but people forget that Coleman was also the mastermind really behind the Common Core standards as well. He grew up, his mom was president of Bennington College, maybe the most left-wing progressive college in the country. He is not a friend. I think to the Heritage Foundation, educational conservatives. And so we're trying to expose this as well. And I think it's almost difficult to exaggerate the power and influence of this organization.
So tell us about the test. Let's talk about that. And then
Sure.
From there, we'll talk a little bit more about education reform at large, which you and all of your colleagues at CLT have become real forces in.
Sure. Yeah. So when you start a standardized test, there's a couple of catch-22s, especially when you're starting one to compete with the SAT and ACT. One is that you have to have a concordance chart for the scores to mean anything. And so if you're measuring something entirely different, you can't actually have a concordance chart. And so CLT, in terms of what are we measuring, which is a great question, we're measuring verbal ability, right? There's a similar section to the SAT. There's verbal reasoning, there's grammar writing, and then there's a quantitative reasoning section as well. So the actual structure of the test and what we're measuring is about as similar as we needed to make it in order for the test to be comparable in terms of a concordance chart. Again, the main difference is going to be source material, what students are actually reading. I think one of the misconceptions is that there's Greek and Latin on the CLT. Some folks who live and breathe in the classical education world, they'll say CLT is kind of classical light, and we're fine with that. There's no Greek, there's no Latin, and we actually named it the classic learning test rather than classical, to try to convey the idea, similar to what happened with Coca-Cola Classic, right? They had a good brand, they went a little crazy and changed the formula, and the consumers weren't happy. And so they went back to the original and they introduced Coca-Cola Classic. And that was the sense that we meant of like, look, we want to be reintroducing what was always considered a good, serious American education. American education was the envy of the world, for a long time. And we want to be getting back to the tried and true. We're almost losing this memory as a country right now. Everybody knew Ben Franklin. Everybody knew the stories. They knew his autobiography, right? And we're starting to forget even what we have lost, which is why I think there's this sense of urgency.
So for someone in the audience, say a parent who says, I love the idea of classical education, but my kids are not in a classical school, they can still take the CLT.
Totally. Yeah. And right now, especially in Florida, we're getting a huge surge of public school students as well. And so again, they're reading meaningful text. When we talk to a school like Hillsdale, and they're talking, well, how do we explain the CLT and what it is to students? What we say is just describe it as a test that better reflects a Hillsdale education, right? Again, no Greek, no Latin. Maybe you're going to read Winston Churchill in the modern age, C.S. Lewis, many thinkers that will never, ever show up on a SAT or ACT.
So let's pivot a little bit, and CLT is part of this, but you are also, whether you want it to be or not, recognized as one of the big education reformers in the country, not just about classic learning tests, but also about the implications for that kind of disruption in the education space. As you take a step back from CLT and you think about your several years leading it, but also in the classroom, what's your sense about the American educational landscape right now?
Sure. I think we're living through something that is absolutely massive, right? And that it's happening so quickly, I think it's hard for a lot of folks to even process. People are asking first principle questions again, for maybe for the first time ever. And COVID in some ways helped this happen, right? Parents had this window into what their students are actually seeing. They're hearing on a Zoom the things the teacher is saying, and they're saying, I didn't sign up for this, right? I mean, parents are very busy, and COVID forced parents to be a little more aware of what their students are actually ingesting every day. And so there's a massive surge into the classical world. And you've seen this. I don't know of a classical charter school in Florida or Texas or Arizona that doesn't have a massive wait list. Typically, the wait list is bigger than the entire school. I mean, truly, building cannot keep up with demand right now. Homeschooling, we've gone from 13,000 in 1973 to well over 5 million homeschoolers today. You know, you and Michelle have been homeschooling for quite some time. And what's undeniable, Kevin, is the difference in these students. You know, and I don't want to bash public school students. I went to public school. There are great families in the public school arena, make no mistake. But you tour a classical school, a classical Christian school, one of these faithfully Catholic schools, one of these classical charters, and it's incredible. It is incredible, the integrity, the way they can speak to adults, the way they treat each other, the order of these schools. Students are well behaved. They're wearing uniforms. I spent my first 3 years teaching in inner city New York. I was breaking up fights. Truancy would show up every day with 30 kids. They'd round it up in the neighborhood, right? Everyone knows that we're in a crisis. And what we've needed is a solution. And I think classical education is now, I think, front and center as the alternative to the mainstream progressive nonsense that's got us where we are.
Yeah, and one of the less understood aspects of the education reform movement right now has to do with something that's particular to the political right in this country. When I made the transition from being full-time administrator, president of Wyoming Catholic, into full-time public policy, it was not fashionable yet for conservatives of all stripes to be involved in curriculum questions. I mean, the whole thing was a very appropriate and still legitimate response, sort of a Milton Friedman-esque focus on universal school choice. That, I want to be really clear. That is 100% correct.
Sure.
But it's like getting one part of a 4-part exam perfect, because there are other parts. And the most important part really is the curriculum, because as you and I presume the audience would understand, it's not just about the nuts and bolts of education. It's also about human formation. Even in a public school. I mean, I understand well as a public school student myself that we are supposedly values neutral. I mean, that's a little nonsensical at this point, but we're non-sectarian, we're a pluralistic society. But even there are Western, capital W, Western social mores, cultural expectations that transcend the pluralism of all American ethnicities. And we've just decided we're not going to be part of that. But in the last 10 years, conservatives are saying this is part of the question too, that we have to have the right curricula. We have to have the right kinds of schools with the right curricula. And we also understand that at the basis of this isn't the job that students are going to have.
Totally.
It's the human person, the dignity that every single one of them has. I think that reframing, while it's much longer term thinking, is really vital to getting the public policy right.
Sure. Yeah. And mainstream education right now, we're seeing this in statistics, and I'm sure you can quote them better than I. It's not producing a love or a sense of gratitude for what they're receiving as Americans, right? And this is where it presents kind of a national security crisis. Either you've got a whole generation of young people who think America is just the big bad bully on the world stage, right? And they don't see the genius of our system of government and how many millions of people it has lifted out of poverty. Education always is about cultivating the affections in some way, for good or for ill, right? And what's been happening, and this is what folks are waking up to, is that the mainstream education system is at fault in a generation that thinks America is the big bad bully and that isn't grateful for the country. A country cannot be sustained on this. One of the books that has influenced me so much is Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind. This is 1986. And he's making a case that any culture, any civilization has to think it's pretty great to even have a chance at survival. That's a prerequisite to surviving. And that America's chances, when we're having a whole generation that thinks it's terrible, it's not going to go well. It's not going to end well. And this is why there's this this sense of urgency.
It's funny you mentioned Bloom's book, Closing the American Mind, nearly 4 decades old now. That's both hard to believe as well as very telling about how long-running a problem education is in this country. And it's a particular tragedy, that reality, because as I'd say often in talks I give around the country, there are many things to commend the American Republic for. But I would argue the greatest is, I do argue, and sort of incessantly, that given our pluralism, given how diverse we are, that the commitment that we have made as a people for decades now, that every American, every single person born in this country, regardless of who they are, who their people are, whether they're poor, rich, whatever, that we guarantee equal opportunity to the best education in the history of the world. That's the American promise. That's like the core of what Martin Luther King was talking about on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, but a mile from where we sit, when he's talking about America fulfilling the promissory note. It's not merely about rights, although that's important. It's not merely about justice, including finally getting racial justice correct. It's about education, because without that, you can't have a republic. You can't have a self-governing people. I'm curious if you think we're beginning to make some progress once again toward that very noble goal, or if there are some obstacles still in the way.
Gosh, I love that. I got out of the train in New York City a couple of years ago, and I can't remember the station. Maybe it's Penn Station, but there's a big E pluribus unum right there in the station.
It's awesome.
That's beautiful. Too bad nobody can understand Latin anymore, or takes note for what that means.
Beautiful architecture and
sure. America has embedded in our founding documents the solution for how you can live well together in a pluralistic society, right? I think our founders anticipated this and understood this. But again, we've adopted this kind of education that doesn't give us an immersion into the way that all of the founders were educated. And so the secret sauce was 100% of them were classically educated. They had read through Aristotle's Politics. They had thought through the strengths and weaknesses of every form of government, which is how they came up with a system of checks and balances. To really love and to appreciate America and the genius of American system of government, you've got to share in their education, I think, as well. So that's where we're hoping to help take this.
So what do you say to someone who hears you say that and they say, Jeremy, I'm with you. I believe that, but I don't know where to start because that's not the education I had.
Sure. Yeah. And I think the homeschooling parents, the folks that have given everything to start schools, that have spent their own savings to start a new classical school. I mean, there has to be a early adopters, a front line. You were weird if you were homeschooling in the 80s or 90s, right? But there were folks that were seeing it long before. You and Michelle started homeschooling your amazing kiddos, and they were the ones to start to make it somewhat normal. So people have to take risks. People have to be willing to put themselves out there and to stand up. I think what we're going to see, Kevin, is a new normal kind of starting to take root. There's something in the kind of the classical arena, which you may have heard of. I think they call it kind of the Goldilocks rule, where once you get to about 300-400 students, parents aren't sending their kids there just because of the first principles and the buy-in, because it's just the best school in the town at that point, right? And everybody's that's starting to happen in the movement as a whole, I think, right now, is people have heard of classical, and there's a general sense that it's kind of the best out there for sure. So,
yeah, I mean, I'm smirking a little bit for those who are not watching, just listening, smirking at this moment, because I remember in the early days of John Paul Academy, the school that I started, we were far from perfect. But we had a couple things going for us. We had a real commitment to our Christian principles, which was very appealing and is appealing, present tense, there. But secondly, a really good curriculum, not because we came up with it. I mean, it's a timeless curriculum. Yeah. But to your point, it was very difficult to break out of this zone of enrollment of like 125 to 175 students, because that was like the core audience. And so these families, their friends, very, very adjacent to them in the community, they kept sending their kids. But we stayed in this zone of about 150 students for a while. And then, interestingly, we started publishing our test scores. This is before a classic learning test. And the test scores are really good.
Yep.
And look, this is a school that is a cross-section of the population, right? So rich kids, poor kids, kids of different intellectual abilities, each of them equal to the others in terms of their dignity, obviously. When that happened, it started to become the school you had to attend.
Yep.
If you wanted to know the truth, capital T, if you wanted a very appealing community inside and out, that is inside the school, but then also where those ambassadors for that truth, the students were going wherever they were living. And the point is to inject some hopefulness for the audience. That's happening, to your point, all over this country. It's really inspiring.
Kevin, I do have a question for you. I mean, as a former head of school, as a founder of a school, former college president, everything you've done on the public policy side, there is maybe even a growing kind of war against standardized testing in general. It seems to be the strongest in the failing areas that are failing the most. What do you see as the future of that? Are conservatives all across the board in how they look at standardized testing?
There's definitely some skepticism there, although it's not about the tests per se, as much as it is about the regime that imposes them. And so what I would say when given the time, and presumably on my show, even though you're asking the question, I've got as much time as I want, that the College Board is part of the regime that conservatives are fighting. And I use regime, as this audience knows, very intentionally. I intend to be derogatory when I say it, because the regime that has imposed the weaponization of the Department of Justice, before they were doing that, they imposed the nonsense of the U.S. Department of Education on us. And so some of us got wise to that earlier or sooner than others, but it's related to your standardized test question for this reason. Conservatives ought not throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'm a huge proponent of standardized testing. Very restrained, very limited for very good purposes. I would argue, even if you and I were not friends, for the mission of classic learning tests. As a headmaster, as a college president, I need some benchmark. I need some yardstick. It's but one, but it's a very important one. And so if I can trust that instrument, that standardized test, is at the very least values neutral, I would say in the case of the classic learning test, it's virtuous. It's got the best of intentions. Then that's something that I want to be part of as a parent, as a school leader, as a policymaker all day long.
Love that. Love that. Yeah, it
was.
wasn't.
Ask the next question.
Well, that's right. It was, I think, early COVID. I believe Congressman Bowman on the floor of the House, described standardized testing as a pillar of systematic racism in America. And you can imagine hearing that as a founder of a standardized test. And I think this is why so many colleges very quickly, and we went from about 35% test optional to about 90%, went. Partly because of COVID, partly because SAT and ACT were sidelined, but also because the last thing any college wants to be called is part of racism. But what's so interesting to me is that the MIT, one of the first big leaders to go back, it was precisely on the grounds of saying, you know what, when you get rid of the standardized test, what you're actually doing is you're going to give the affluent kids, the connected kids, even more of an opportunity because this is the least easy thing to kind of game, getting the patent or getting published or whatever else, that's going to lend itself to, so my hope is that we're seeing the pendulum start to shift back towards saying, you know what, this isn't everything, but as you said, it is something in the right context that matters.
Yeah. And I'd say as a homeschooling dad, and my wife would agree with this, which is more important than what I say because she's the one actually doing the homeschooling, that we're big proponents of very limited number of hours in using the particular standardized tests we do. Our 3 oldest kids have taken the appropriate versions of the CLT, and number 4 will when the time comes. So the last couple of questions, because you and I could geek out on standardized tests and concordance charts and all that for a long time. But for the purposes of the audience, look into your crystal ball on American education, and let's say a time horizon of 10 to 20 years. I'm presuming that this shift that we've seen in the very makeup, the very format of American schools will continue. What does it look like, though, say in 2033 or 2043?
Yeah, I think to really influence the culture, I think that 20% is what we need in terms of getting that percentage of the American population into these kinds of schools. There's no doubt that a student who has received a great classical education, they know how to actually think. They're going to be the future people, I think, that are going to be running for office. They're going to be in leadership roles. They're going to be our doctors and our lawyers. And so I'm an optimist, Kevin. I really am. I think that the American story isn't finished yet. I think there's going to be bright days ahead, but I think it's going to require continuing to keep our foot on the gas pedal in terms of remembering that there's something worth saving here for sure. So I think we're going to continue to see, and I think classical itself is really right now at this tipping point where, and I experienced the same thing as you said a few minutes ago. When we started CLT, we were always explaining even what is that? What even is classical education? Most people hadn't heard of it. Everybody's heard of it now. Everybody can make some reference point of, oh, my niece is in a classical school in Kansas, or there's somewhere where that they have heard of this already. And then in terms of CLT, we've been saying this for 5 years and people thought we were totally nuts. They think we're a little less nuts now and that we're serious. But yeah, it's our goal to be number one over the College Board and ACT, and we want to do that by 2040. So we've got 17 years left to do that, and we think we can beat them with having a better mission for education, what it actually is. And then we think we can beat them just on the basics of customer service, better technology as well. We met with somebody just a few weeks ago, and he said it this way. He said, you'll never find an organization in America that hates itself more than the College Board. It's a standardized testing company that thinks standardized testing is racist. Like, it doesn't know why it exists at this point.
It's an icon for the regime. There's no coherent, organized philosophy.
Sure.
There used to be one on the American left that we might disagree with, but we could at least respect.
Yeah.
And that just doesn't exist anymore. So one last question. It's a practical one. You've already mentioned to the audience why you're optimistic, and that's usually the last question I ask. But let's say someone listened to this conversation. They didn't go to a classical school and they're inspired now. Is there a book or two or some website that you would suggest they go to so they can learn more?
Yeah, I think the book that has become kind of the book is Kevin Clark and Ravi Jain, The Liberal Arts Tradition, in terms of it's kind of like your Mere Christianity of classical education. Like, what is this? And so that's the first one. Again, it's The Liberal Arts Tradition, Kevin Clark and Ravi Jain. Just go to Amazon and find that right there. So that would definitely be the place that I would recommend starting out at.
Jeremy Tate, founder, CEO of the Classic Learning Test. Thanks for being here.
Kevin Roberts, thank you. Thanks for the great work you're doing here at Heritage.
Well, folks, I hope you enjoyed that conversation. I hope that if you're someone who's familiar with classical education, you particularly enjoyed that. But even more than you, if you're someone else who doesn't know about classical schools, you don't know about the Classic Learning Test, I hope that you're inspired to get involved, because this is the path for taking back, for reclaiming American schools. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time, keep your chin up.
The Kevin Roberts Show is brought to you by more than 500,000 members of the Heritage Foundation. The producer is Philip Reynolds. Sound design by Lauren Evans, Mark Guiney, and Tim Kennedy. For more information and to subscribe, please visit heritage.org.